In the dim memory of the American South, where valleys drink the fog and ridgelines carve the horizon, there lives a legend that refuses to sleep. It begins in the autumn of 1843, among the valleys and knuckled ridges of northern Alabama, a country of steep ravines and dark forests, where the Cumberland Plateau rises like a wall. Settlers called it rugged, hunters called it treacherous. For one man, it became both sanctuary and sentence. His name, in whispers first and then in shouts, was Samuel Green, on the Johnson plantation, about 20 miles northeast of Huntsville. His life was written in someone else's ledger. Sam, age 22, field hand. William Johnson, the master, had come from Georgia years earlier, and now held more than 40 people in bondage. The mountains to the east stood watch, their slopes dense and shadowed, their hollows as secret as a locked chest. For someone who dreamed of breaking chains, those heights were a promise and a dare. Samuel had tried twice to run. The ledgers noted him as troublesome. The scars on his body told a sharper truth. On an unseasonably cold night, October 11th, 1843, under wind and rain that lashed the fields and keened along the fences, he disappeared for the third and final time. This escape was not a sprint fueled by panic. It was deliberate. He took a wool blanket, a butcher's knife from the smokehouse, a careful measure of dried provisions. When the storm eased, the overseer found only footprints that vanished into the brush, as if the earth had swallowed him. Most fugitives who managed to slip away turned their faces north, chasing the rumor of free states and safe houses. Samuel went the other direction, deeper into the high country of northeastern Alabama, where the valleys are narrow and the nights grow close, where even the boldest settlers rarely roamed. For months there was silence. Then, in January of 1844, a hunter named Elijah Thornton told the Jackson County sheriff that he'd seen a tall black man in animal skins, carrying a spear and a knife, moving like a deer through the thickets near the waters we now call Guntersville Lake. When the hunter tried to call out, the figure slipped into the brush and was gone. Others soon told similar stories, trappers, woodcutters, the few families that had scratched out homesteads where the land grudgingly allowed. The descriptions matched and multiplied. A tall man, his left cheek marked by a noticeable scar, dressed not in plantation rags but in hides and furs, a survivor who knew the language of trees and stones. At first, these sightings were a curiosity that rolled around in conversation like a smooth pebble. By spring, fear had sharpened the pebble to a blade. A hunting party led by a man named Thomas Wilkes failed to return to their settlement, near what is now Scottsboro. Searchers found their camp wrecked. 3 men were missing. The fourth, James Carter, was discovered wedged inside a hollow tree, shivering, wordless with terror until his voice returned and spilled out a story of a mountain devil who drifted among the trunks as silent as thought. Killing without sound and with terrible skill, officials called the tale madness. The months ahead would argue otherwise. Through summer into fall, cabins reported thefts, not of coins or keepsakes, but of the useful things of daily life. A pot, an axe head, a length of rope, a flint and steel, a good knife, a warm shirt. The strange part was how it happened. People swore they'd slept through the night, then found the door latch unfastened and something missing, as if the house itself had loaned an item to the dark. By winter, the talk had a name for the figure in the hills, the mountain devil. No ordinary runaway, folks said, but a man with uncanny abilities, a spirit of the wild who moved soundlessly and endured anything, and who held a particular hatred for hunters and the men who chased down fugitives for pay. Newspapers in Huntsville mocked the superstition but admitted, bluntly, that a fugitive was living as a savage in the highlands. The jeers quieted in February of 1845, when a famous slave catcher named Jeremiah Burke led 6 men and 4 hounds into the mountains with one mission: bring Samuel Green back in chains. On the second night, with camp made by a cold stream and the dogs restless, the forest overturned the hunters. The hounds fell silent. Figures passed between the trees. A man reached and another man vanished. One survivor, Michael Reynolds, was carried downstream on icy water, clinging to a fallen trunk. He swore that as he floated past a bend, He saw a tall figure on the bank with a bow watching. "He could have put an arrow through me," Reynolds said later. "He let me go instead." Someone wanted the story told. 5 white men had died in a single night, men paid to retrieve human property. The state could pretend no longer. In March, the governor authorized a militia expedition to capture or kill the fugitive, now named plainly in official letters, Samuel Green. Captain William Hall led 40 armed men into the broken country of rock and pine. For 3 weeks they hunted a ghost. They found campfires still warm, clever caches of supplies hidden in caves, braided traps, prints that ended abruptly on stone, and on far ridgelines a figure that dwindled before anyone could close the distance. On the 18th day, they discovered a shelter built into the face of a cliff, using a natural cave as its bones and extending it with walls of timber and a roof of thatch. Inside they found an arsenal, rifles with powder and lead, knives of different lengths, spears, a tough bow with a bundle of straight-fletched arrows. They also found the belongings of men who had vanished in the last year, trinkets and tokens, a belt here, a tin there, a cheap watch whose tick had long since guttered out. And they found a book, not finely bound, but sewn with animal hide and filled with a hand that wrote clear and hard. The journal stunned them. Samuel's voice in those pages was not the voice the law expected. It was lucid, honed, fierce. He recorded abuse on the plantation without self-pity, and described his first 2 failed escapes without apology. He wrote too of what the mountains had made of him. "In these heights," the hand declared, "I became what they feared. They forged me. I returned the work." He mentioned companions and never named, only called brothers in bondage, and the practices of survival: hunt, gather, build, take what you cannot craft. The militia lingered a week and swept the valleys again, but Samuel and any allies had vanished deeper than maps. After that, the hills grew quiet for a season. Some said the wild had claimed him. Others swore he had gone at last toward the free soil of the north. Quiet ended like a door slamming. On January 7, 1846, William Johnson, the master whose ledger had abbreviated Samuel's life, was found dead in his study, the house locked from within. Nothing stolen, a single wound in his chest. An arrow had driven straight to the heart. On the desk lay a sheet in careful handwriting. "Justice comes even to the mighty. Remember Samuel Green." Men who had scoffed went pale. A second expedition took shape. Over 60 men, several seasoned trackers from Tennessee, and instructions not to bother with capture. They left on January 20th and returned 2 weeks later without 17 of their number. The survivors told of misdirection and dread, of false trails that seemed true in daylight and fatal by dusk, of camps broken by hands that never showed themselves, of messages carved into trees where the bark ran white. You hunt a man who learned to hunt from watching you. Major Thomas Bradford, who commanded the expedition, wrote in his report, "We face not a man but a phantom of these mountains. He strikes and is gone. My men look at the valleys as if they were graves. He withdrew them. Better fear than burial. What followed was not a barrage but a pressure, a weather of presence. Travelers came across words etched into trunks that warned the cruel they were seen. Patrols refused assignments that crossed the high edges. People spoke of a Cherokee tale, hard to kill even after the removals of the 1830s, about a spirit of vengeance who sheltered the hunted. Escapes from plantations near the mountains rose sharply. There was no ledger that could prove Samuel stood behind the rise. But among the enslaved, stories moved from mouth to mouth in a hush. There were paths no patroller knew. There were men in the high country who could guide you after moonrise. There was a name you could carry like a talisman: Green. In August of 1847, a team of surveyors working near the Alabama-Georgia line met a man who matched the legend. He came openly, without weapons in hand, and spoke with them for nearly an hour. Edward Mitchell, the leader, later said the man introduced himself as Samuel Green. He was weathered, yes, but the mountains had not broken him. He spoke with the calm of someone who recognizes himself. "I have made these mountains remember me," he said. "Now I'll see whether freedom remembers me in return. After that, nothing certain. Not one more official sighting. Not one arrest, not one body. The story could have ended there, with a final glimpse and a question. Instead, it kept walking. Through the 1850s, murmurs of the mountain devil found their way to the ears of planters who pretended not to fear the dark. People accused of cruelty watched the tree line when they rode home late. During the Civil War, when Union regiments moved through parts of northern Alabama, officers recorded hearing tales of a black phantom who had terrorized slave catchers years before. One captain scribbled that an elderly Cherokee man claimed to have sheltered Samuel in the days before he left the region. According to that account, Greene had gone north and crossed into Canada. Proof never hardened around that claim, but a letter surfaced decades later, written in May of 1848 by a Quaker abolitionist in Pennsylvania. He described a remarkable man newly arrived from the southern wilderness who called himself Samuel, and said he had lived like a wild man in the Alabama mountains after escaping bondage. The Quaker said the traveler bore scars in mind and body, but also a dignity that drew respect. The man intended to continue to Canada, wary that even free states might not protect him from laws written to drag him backward. The writer noted the man carried a small leather journal and wrote well. After that letter, silence again. If Samuel reached Canada, he may have changed his name, as many did. If he died on the way, the earth kept his story close. Yet the effect of his 4 years in the high country did not fade. The patrols remembered. The overseers remembered. In the plantations nearest the mountains, the lash fell less often. A few owners admitted, at least a family, that a devil in the hills made them cautious. Among the enslaved, the story became a code, not only escape but defiance, and when the balance tipped far enough, retribution. During the war, some people fleeing the fields did not run to Union lines first. They aimed for the ridges as if a guardian still walked them. Soldiers sent guides east to fetch the runaways back, listening to them speak of a man named Greene as if he still watched from the trees. In Reconstruction, the legend took on new shapes. For black communities, Samuel became a symbol of self-determination, proof that bondage could be answered with skill and courage. For many white communities that grieved lost power, he became a cautionary tale, a nightmare that explained the need to reassert control. But even among those who feared him, there was an unwilling respect for what he had done. Not indiscriminate brutality, but surgical strikes against men who enforced bondage with zeal. There were no records of him harming women or children. When the surveyor had spoken with him, the meeting had been peaceable. The portrait that emerged was not a demon or a saint, but a man who answered the world he had been given with the means that world had taught him. Time carried scholars to the story. In the late 20th century, archaeologists found a small dwelling tucked under a rock overhang in the Cumberland Plateau, a shelter that had a clear view over one of the few paths into that pocket of country. The charcoal dated to the right era. The tools looked handmade, the weapons modified, the construction clever and careful, most striking. A metal button surface that matched those used on clothing at the Johnson plantation in the 1840s. No one could prove the shelter was Samuel's, but the evidence felt like a handprint in old clay, even as highways braided the valleys and towns bloomed where forest once held sway. Some communities kept the memory alive. Church records from a small AME congregation near Scottsboro mentioned yearly gatherings on January 7th, the night Justice visited William Johnson. Families called it Remembrance Day. Elderly members interviewed in the 1970s spoke of prayers said for the free one, the Shadow Man, the Mountain Samuel. As the civil rights movement pressed the past up into public view, historians began to place Greene alongside the Maroons, the people who carved refuge out of hostile country rather than fleeing first to distant sanctuaries. In Virginia's Great Dismal Swamp and in the Louisiana bayous, larger communities had formed. In the Alabama highlands, Samuel's circle was small by design, invisible by necessity. He was not building a town. He was building a life and a perimeter. He was showing others, a handful at a time, that under the right night and with the right knowledge the hunted could become something else. Stories from families echoed that idea. A woman in Tennessee, nearly a century old when she gave her interview in 1969, said her grandfather had once run with the mountain man. He had learned to walk without leaving sign, to feed a winter's hunger with traps of his own making, to turn a tree into a shelter and a stream into a road. They lived together almost 2 years, she said, before Samuel chose the north and her grandfather chose to wait out the war in the high ground. It's tempting to demand a clean ending, a grave and a date, a testimony in a courthouse, a final page in a known archive. Samuel's life refuses that. He lived where the historical record thins to whispers, where the powerful recorded only what concerned them and the powerless recorded little, because doing so was dangerous. The closest we have to his own voice is the journal taken from the cliffside shelter. Even that does not tell us how he died, or where he finally laid his head to rest. What it tells us is enough to understand his purpose. He inverted the order. In a system engineered to reduce human beings to property, he made the wilderness into a court no planter could convene, and rendered verdicts by his own hand. The mountains were not simply a hiding place. They were a crown he wore without permission, a kingdom of one, reached not by inheritance but by grit, craft, and a refusal to return. In our century, the legend has crept back into daylight. A small museum in Scottsboro mounted an exhibit about the mountain devil, careful to mark the story as legend where proof runs thin, but bold about the courage at its core. A historical marker went up near one of the rumored encampments. Descendants of enslaved families in the region began gathering memories, the fragments, the sayings, the maps drawn in margins, and sharing them at reunions. Whether every single detail is literally true, one organizer said, matters less than what Samuel stands for. Refusal, determination, the right to fight for your life. Park rangers say hikers come now because of the story. They want to walk the same ridges. Some arrive believing, others curious. A few convinced they feel a presence as dusk settles and the cool flows down the hollows like water. The ranger shrugs at the ghost talk, but she admits this. Even with phones and GPS and lines painted on trees, people still get lost in those valleys. If a man knew every fold of that land and trained himself to move when the light went thin, he could step out of a shadow and disappear back into it before your eyes had caught up with your fear. Scholars of black survivalism have taken up Samuel as a study in the art of living under pressure so deep it warps the world. He did not only last, he mastered. He learned the birdsong that changes when a stranger is near, the way pine duff muffles a footfall, the paths water carves and how to ride them. He learned to turn fear outward. A patrol that hesitates at the foot of a slope is already halfway beaten. An overseer who reins in his cruelty because he believes the trees are watching has already cracked the lie that authority is absolute. Every such crack matters. In the towns of the northern Alabama uplands today, opinion still splits along familiar seams. Some shake their heads, a dramatic tale too dramatic to be true. Some nod, a necessary tale truer than the records that refuse to see us. An outfitter even sells mountain devil hikes now, turning fear into a brochure. The irony would not be lost on Samuel. The man who turned the wild into a weapon would recognize a different kind of economy in it. How the dominant culture tries to sell what once threatened it. When you strip away other people's uses of him, what remains is a man formed by brutality and remade by terrain. He chose a path most did not choose, and we should honor that most chose differently, to flee quietly, to bear witness in words that built a movement. But the tradition he stands in, the Maroons' refusal to accept the terms offered by the oppressor, is part of the same long resistance. Harriet Tubman's lantern is one light in that night. Samuel Green's arrow is another. The ambiguity of his end is a kind of fittingness. He is a figure who stands between ledger and legend, proven enough to anchor belief, shadowed enough to leave room for the imagination that kept so many people alive when hard proof would have gotten them killed. His last words to the surveyors, if we trust the telling, sound like a man who had weighed his life and found it worth its cost. I made these mountains remember me. Now I go to find what freedom truly means. And then there is the last passage in the journal found in the cliffside shelter, the one that still feels like a drum in the chest. They made me property. These mountains made me a man. They made me invisible. Here I learned to see in darkness. They tried to break my spirit. Instead, they forged something they could never command. I am what they created, turned back upon its creators. Let history remember this truth. History has, imperfectly. The ridges are still there. The valleys still hold the fog, and with it the old stories. Stand on a lookout as evening cools and the hills run away from you in layer after blue layer. It's easy to wonder what else the trees have seen. What other acts of courage or terror lie buried under leaves? Which names were not written because no one dared? It's easy, too, to ask what Samuel would make of us now. Whether he'd look at our roads and our signs and our tours and shake his head, or whether he'd be glad that the fear he once fed back to the powerful has thinned into caution and, for some, respect. If you listen long enough, the wind will offer a sentence from far away, a vow carried from another century. I was born a slave, but I will not die one, not in body nor in spirit. If there is a path through the dark, I will find it, and for those who come after, let them know it can be done.